In 1880, Ulysses S. Grant wanted back in the game. Voters had forgiven the beloved general for the corruption of his first 2 terms, and his image had been rehabilitated by a triumphant world tour where he was greeted as a hero by everyone from diplomats to commoners. So he tried to get his party's nomination, but instead, another Ohio general, James Garfield, emerged at the Republican convention. It was he, not Grant, who won the nomination and then the presidency. Number 20, James A. Garfield, Republican, 1881, 49 years old, from Ohio. He was the first former college president and only preacher to hold the office. And he was the last person to move directly from the House of Representatives to the White House. Garfield was a large, outgoing man. He was well-read and not bored at all by the intricacies of policymaking.
He's what today you would call a policy wonk. He was someone who would take an issue, for instance, like the tariff, and fill notebooks with detailed calculations about how the tariff works and how different industries work. He's someone who, in the summer of 1880, at least 4 times he would skip away from sessions of the House of Representatives to go watch baseball, professional baseball being played on the Washington Mall.
As a politician, Garfield was known to be a bit of a waffler.
It was something of a weakness that he proved to be not very decisive. He didn't seem to want to ruffle any feathers. He tried to make everyone happy, and in effect, he made no one happy.
Garfield's first job as president was to dole out political appointments. It was a notoriously corrupt process. But the scandals among Ulysses Grant's appointees, who were mostly his cronies, had contributed to an outcry for merit-based appointments. This issue of civil service reform had been left at Garfield's doorstep, and he decided to challenge the old system by taking on powerful New York Senator Roscoe Conkling over who should be appointed chief collector of the Port of New York. Conkling had traditionally filled this important civil service post with his own cronies.
Now, as an analogy, imagine today, for instance, that the senator from the state of Virginia would point to the fact that the Pentagon is on the Virginia side of the Potomac River. Therefore, he should have control of who is the Secretary of Defense and all of his staff. It was that kind of claim, which at the time was actually very common.
Garfield decided to challenge this political tradition by appointing a rival of Conkling's to be chief collector. It was a risky move for the new president. But despite a firestorm of opposition, Garfield held firm, and Conkling ended up resigning from the Senate in protest.
Garfield wins, which surprised a lot of people.
That was the beginning of the end of Conkling's machine and the old spoil system. Of course, Garfield didn't live long enough to see all the fruits of that victory.
The series of events that would lead to the untimely death of President Garfield began in the early days of his presidency.
When Garfield moved into the White House in his first days as president, he was barraged by questions of patronage and appointments. The White House itself was a very open forum. Anyone could walk in. There was no Secret Service protection at the time. Every day, Garfield would visit with office seekers. And while Garfield tried to limit himself to picking the office heads or the major positions, he couldn't avoid being barraged by the legions of job seekers.
One of these job seekers was a man named Charles Guiteau. He was a strange fellow who had spent the campaign season of 1880 hanging around Republican Party headquarters in New York, and now felt he was owed a diplomatic appointment by the Garfield administration. He identified himself strongly with a faction of the party called the Stalwarts, which included Senator Conkling and Garfield's vice president, Chester A. Arthur.
Yeah, he had at one point shook Arthur's hand and at another point made his way into Garfield's waiting area in the White House. But he was seen as somewhat of a joke.
Upset that the Garfield administration ignored his requests for a diplomatic appointment, angry at Garfield's slight to Conkling, and believing he had a calling from God, Guiteau set out to remove the president. On July 2, 1881, Guiteau stalked Garfield to the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad station in Washington and shot him twice. One bullet grazed the president's arm, the other lodged in his torso. As the police hauled Guiteau away, he declared,
"I did it. I will go to jail. I am a stalwart, and Arthur will be president."
Charles Guiteau has earned the everlasting moniker of a disappointed office seeker, sometimes a disgruntled office seeker. But Charles Guiteau is not a disgruntled or disappointed office seeker. He's insane.
Garfield didn't die right away. As he lingered, the assassin's bullet still in his body, every change in his condition was telegraphed across the country.
Sometimes he would improve and almost look like he would recover. But during that period, the nation really rallied to support the president, and he had far greater popularity after he was shot than before.
We know now that Garfield may well have been killed by his own doctors or the efforts of his doctors to save him.
They would stick instruments and fingers up into Garfield's back.
The medical care was atrocious, even for that era.
In August, Garfield wrote a letter to his mother back in Ohio, telling her not to worry. "It is true I am still weak and on my back," he wrote, "but I am gaining every day and need only time and patience to bring me through." On September 19th, 79 days after being shot and only 6 months after taking office, the president died. The only legacy of Garfield's brief presidency was his battle against the New York political machine.
The real accomplishment of Garfield in the end, had he lived to build on it, was that he in fact took a stand against that system. He in fact finally said no to the most powerful boss of his time on a question of patronage and made it stick.
Garfield would become a martyr for the civil service reform movement. It would be up to his vice president, Chester Arthur, himself a product of the New York political machine, to continue the fight. During the 2 months that President Garfield lay dying from his gunshot wounds, Congress was out of session. It is said the country continued to run smoothly nonetheless.